Hello, my name is Father Jude Eli, and I represent Western Dominican Preaching Ministry. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation this evening, examining the body of evidence, the resurrection of Christ in the Gospel of John. We have multiple attestations for Jesus' resurrection. First, in the synoptic tradition, that is the tradition of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We also have a unique theological interpretation of Jesus' resurrection as seen in the Gospel of John. Again, to have a certain historical timeline, we believe that Jesus died approximately 30 or 31 AD during the month of Nisan, during the Passover festival. And the first writings of the New Testament, namely St. Paul, the Pauline corpus, all of his letters. Paul is, in fact, the first one to manifest in his letters the ultimate belief that Jesus Christ has, in fact, been raised from the dead. The first gospel, namely Mark, approximately written at about 70. Matthew's gospel, middle to late 70s. The Gospel of Luke, middle 80s. And most biblical scholars believe the Gospel of John, 90 to 95. And so we're looking at a certain understanding of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from about 60 years after the actual event. And so this is a very common reality in ancient Hebraic writing. You experience the event, and in the course of time, ancient Israel and now the apostolic community makes memory, recalls to mind, and in the Greek anamnesis, you make memory, recall to mind, so that what happened so many decades ago is now, in fact, applicable to us as we read about that experience. And that can be either in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures or in the New Testament gospel tradition. So, for example, what is the purpose of John's gospel? As it relates to Jesus' resurrection, we find his stated purpose in John chapter 20, verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus Christ is in fact the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is kind of like a secondary John 9 prologue. It explains explicitly what has been recorded and what not has been recorded. And it's very similar to Luke's narrative. Remember, when you look at Luke's gospel, Luke also has a short prologue in which Luke is saying, I am here to compile an orderly account of all the traditions and experiences and the narrative prose that have been written so far. And I'm going to put them into an orderly, cohesive, chronological document so that you might understand that the eyewitnesses of these events, who are now ministers of the word, again to use a Lucan term, when you are an eyewitness, you automatically become a witness of the word. Why? Because you saw, tasted, touched, handled, you experienced it, and now it has become a part of your life. Okay? And so at this juncture, John has the exact same situation. John is saying, there are many things that Jesus did. Not all of them are, in fact, written in this book. And so, but these have been written that you may understand and now believe the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth. And so many biblical scholars will take the Gospel of John and they will, in fact, separate it. Chapter 1 to chapter 12, the book of signs, symbols. Book of signs mean that these are the events, the actions of Jesus that in a real, explicit, demonstrative way explain who Jesus was. Then from chapter 12 to chapter 21, we have what we call the book of glory. Glory here means God's manifest presence. Glory means how God is in fact dwelling. It means the divine presence. And the divine presence is in fact in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And it's with that understanding that we look at the resurrection narrative as seen from the Johannine tradition. Understand the very nature of the parallel Gospels. Namely, you can have one event talked about in many, many different ways. John's Gospel is not a parallel narrative. It is uniquely its own Hebraic Christian genre. Again, written about 90 to 95 AD. It was written for possibly Hellenized Jews or Hellenized Christians. And so at this juncture, John wants to say, what happened at the tomb? And one thing that if you look at the gospel narratives as they are presented in the synoptic tradition, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we look at that experience seen in the Johannine tradition, you'll find there is a immense difference. It is very different. Why? Because the emphasis has in fact changed. What John wants to do now is try to theologically explain the events that perhaps were not written in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and or explain with another theological emphasis or understanding, or another prolongation of the interpretation of the oral tradition that had been multiplied throughout the apostolic community. So John offers a unique understanding unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, for example, we read after the death of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, this is John chapter 19, verse 38. Now, after the death of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, and I might add, in the other gospel narratives, he was a member of the Sanhedrin. That's how we get the evidence, by the way. What was the trial like? There were eyewitnesses who later became disciples of Christ and ministered within the apostolic community. But he was a disciple secretly and asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. So he came and took away the body. Nicodemus, again, not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, also, who had first come to him by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes. They took the body of Jesus, bound it in linen cloths and with spices, as is the custom in Jewish burial. Interesting. John wants to say there are binding cloths. Jesus is in fact fulfilled. Again, he is a faithful Jew, and he had the right to have a full Jewish burial. Now, we read in the chapter 41, now in the place where he was crucified there was once a garden. And in the garden was a new tomb that no one had ever been laid in. So, because of the Jewish day of preparation, as the tomb was closed at hand, they laid Jesus there. Again, they could not work on the Sabbath. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus' body not being anointed. That's why the women went to the grave. That's why the women went to the tomb to do the normal burial practices common within Judaism. So right there is a change of emphasis. Why does John want to emphasize anointing? Because in the theological sense, who is Jesus? He is the Christ, the Messiah, which means one who has been anointed. So there is that emphasis that may or may not necessarily be present in the synoptic tradition. So now what happens? On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. In that particular regard, John matches up Mark and Luke, but not Matthew, because in the Matthean tradition, the angel of the Lord descends from heaven and then opens the tomb. But in Mark and Luke, it's already been open. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one of whom Jesus loved, and said to them, They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Interesting point here. The Lord's disciples presumed the body was in fact going to be there, but it wasn't. When it's missing, Mary Magdalene runs back to the disciples and says, they have taken the body. So that means the early apostolic community, when it comes to the Lord's resurrection, they had no access to the body. They did not presume that Jesus was in fact going to rise from the dead. So the resurrection is not some sort of theological, mythical invention of the church in order that people might believe so that they might believe in everlasting life. It simply doesn't follow. So what we have here is that the disciples go to the tomb. Peter and the beloved disciple, namely John. Most scholars think that it is in fact John. And what happens? Peter reached the tomb first, and stooping to look in, he saw the linen clothes lying by themselves, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb, and he saw what? The linen clothes lying, and the napkin, or the head covering, which had been on his head, not lying with the other linen clothes, but rolled up and placed in a corner by itself. Interesting point here. Jewish mortuary treatment. You would have been covered with a shroud. You would have been tied, ankles and feet, hands, a head chin wrap to make sure that the body, after rigor mortis, that the mouth would not hang. Then there was a napkin placed over the face, or a rather large piece of linen cloth. So at this point, they actually fulfill normal Jewish burial mortuary practices. What's so significant about this is that this is not mentioned in the synoptic tradition, and that's the emphasis I want to place. There is another tradition, and I might add a valued, authentic tradition that perhaps the eyewitnesses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not have or did not choose to write about. By the way, all because it isn't written doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It's simply it wasn't included. So the Johannine narrative includes things that are not found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you have to look at it this way here, huh? Peter looks in, stoops, looks at, and he sees the linen. Now, if the body was in fact stolen, first of all, some scholars believe, well, was Jesus buried in a common mortuary site? So there were many burial slabs on which many bodies could have been laying, and maybe they took the wrong one, or someone could have easily come in and stole the body. That's not what we found in Matthew, and that's not what we find in John. No, it is the tomb belongs to Joseph of Arimathea, and it's a newly hewn tomb in which no one has ever used. And it's one tomb, and only one tomb, one mortuary slab. So at this particular juncture, you have to ask the question, if they wanted to steal the body, why unwrap it? You have Jesus of Nazareth being crucified. You have Jesus of Nazareth beaten, scourged at the pillar. His body would have been oozing fluids. You do not take a naked man that has been dead for 3 days, or perhaps 2 days, where there's bodily fluid everywhere. And again, about Jewish kosher law, if you were a truly observant Jew, you did not touch dead bodies. It made you ritualistically defiled. And you could not participate in the Passover feast, much less the Sabbath, if you were ritualistically defiled, unless you took a mikvah, which is a form of ritualized bath. So if you're going to steal the body, or if the disciples stole the body, which again, when you look at Matthew's gospel, that is exactly the charge that the Sanhedrin, once the soldiers came back from the tomb after they saw the vision of the angel, and they reported the entire affair to the Jewish council. And so then they go to Pilate. And so the problem is, how do we keep the soldiers out of difficulty? We will bribe them and say that the disciples came late that night and stole the body. Well, that doesn't make sense here. If you're going to steal a body, you want to get in and out as fast as you possibly can. Jesus was a well-known political, social, theological figure, and so the entire city was out for his own crucifixion. So his tomb would have been guarded. Now, that guard at the tomb is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but there's no mention of a guard found in John. Absolutely none. Again, this is a different emphasis. John is not going to repeat that which has already been written later, that which has already been written earlier. He isn't going to do that. So what happens? If you're going to steal the body, you're not going to unwrap it. First. Second, the headband or the head napkin or the part of the shroud that covered the face of Jesus is rolled over and folded and put in another place in the corner. If you are a robber, if you are a disciple, why would you do that? That makes no sense whatsoever. If you're going to rob, you are going to do it as fast as you possibly can. You are not going to be bothered about folding things up. Why would you fold it up? Makes no sense. Unless, of course, the folding was done by Jesus. That's why when Peter and John come into the tomb, they look at the linen cloths and then they believe. Well, why would just simply looking at linen cloths used for a mortuary custom, why would that be a point of belief? Perhaps they thought, that's Jesus all right. He always used to fold things. There's something about that gesture. There's something about that sign that was representative of something that Jesus would in fact do. You just don't believe because something has been folded up. Something triggered the memory, again, the anamnesis, to make memory, to recall to mind, that's something that he would have done. Jesus is alive. He is, in fact, alive. He's not dead. So at this particular juncture, what do we have? The other disciples reached the tomb, first went in and saw and believed. The body is gone. And the Apostolic 12 had nothing to do with it. Of course, you have to ask, well, if they didn't steal it, who would? And to what end? And then you have to ask the question, did the Apostolic 12 understand the words of Jesus about his imminent resurrection after his death? Yeah, the answer of that is absolutely not. They did not understand. That's why John wants to say, for as yet they did not know the scripture, again, messianic prophecy, that he must rise from the dead. They were expecting Jesus to be there. And when he's not, people are mystified. One thing for sure about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and now John's gospel, they all say one thing: the tomb is empty. And we didn't have the body. Plain and simple. So at this point, the John 9 narrative moves on. Mary Magdalene stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped down to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus lay, one at the head and one at the feet. Very similar to Lucan narrative, two men in dazzling apparel. Okay? And they said to the woman, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Saying this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. This is very similar in the Lucan narrative. Easter evening, the walk to Emmaus, chapter 24, verse 16, when Jesus approaches the two disciples who are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, they don't understand or don't recognize him. That's why in verse 16 of chapter 24, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. That is the exact same issue that we have here. We're not talking about simply some sort of physicality materiality where we can recognize Jesus. No, this is a literary device. The disciples, for whatever reason, are preventing from recognizing Jesus. But in the Lucan narrative, they only recognize him at the breaking of the bread. He blessed, broke the bread, and gave it to them. And in the Lucan tradition, at that point, he will in fact vanish. And now, Mary looks at this Jesus whom she does not recognize. And the person says to her, Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?" Of course, in the Lucan narrative, why do you seek the living among the dead? See, that's the point of this. Supposing him to be the gardener, he said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher, self-identity. Jesus identifies Mary. Mary now identifies who she is seeing. Then Mary Magdalene went and said to the apostles, "I've seen the Lord." Again, empirical evidence. "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Okay, the body of evidence. In a classical Hebraic and also Christian understanding of Jewish literature, again, you can have one event talked about in many different ways. Each can be, in its own way, accurate. That's why you have to be very careful not to apply modern methods of historiography to a type of literary genre that doesn't fit. Modern historiography likes to be accurate, chronological, objective, and absolutely empirical. And it's good that it is so. Because if it's a true revelation of God, the God of our reason is also the God of our faith. We do not hold that there are two sources of truth. So what we have here is a particular nuanced description of what happened at the tomb. And what happened at the tomb has to be understood as coming from a Jewish Semitic mindset. It's good to use historical critical methods that deduce their first principles from the scientific method. All that is wonderful. But understand, good as that is, it is still a limited method. In order to understand what actually occurred, you have to understand what was the mindset of a Semite 2,000 years ago. And if you're going to read the Old Testament, the exact same thing. What is the mindset of a Semite about 3,500 years ago when the Hebrew Scriptures were started to be written? You have to understand it on its own terms. So the best of our ability, we apply the methods of science, the methods of the critical historical process to the text, but understanding it is a limited process. It is a limited process. It is a limited method. Christians of faith do not fear the reason of science. I want to make that very clear. Christians of faith do not fear the reason of science, human experience. We embrace it. So what we have in John's gospel, at least for the first part of the resurrectional narrative, is an attempt by the biblical writer to say things about the resurrection that have not necessarily been written down in the earlier biblical traditions. And in the Jewish mind, you can have one event and with many different emphasis. That's why, and biblical scholars recognize this point. You have the four resurrectional narratives. Scholars realize that you cannot syncretize them all. They are not necessarily always compatible. Instead, you are saying these are 4 unique presentations of one central event. One thing is clear. The body isn't there. The tomb is empty. And the disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ did not expect Jesus to rise from the dead. That's why in each narrative, they went to the tomb. And they're faced with one thing. Jesus is not here. The tomb is empty. And now we have people experiencing the resurrection of Jesus in a unique form. The form being with a resurrected body. And that is the body of evidence. That's why we believe. And in the words of John, and we ask that you also may believe, that these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you may have life in his name.
For a Christian, believing in God cannot be separated from believing in the one whom he has sent, his beloved Son, in whom the Father is well pleased. God tells us to listen to him. The Lord himself said to his disciples, "Believe in God, believe also in me." We can believe in Jesus Christ because he is himself God, the Word made flesh. No one has ever seen God, but the only Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known, because he has seen the Father. Jesus Christ is the only one who knows him and can reveal him.